All right. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. I am looking over on my other screen to go live on Instagram. All right. Is it going to cooperate? I think it will. Yep. Here we go. All
Haha.
right, guys. I love it when tech works. All right. Welcome. Happy Thursday, everybody. And I am so looking forward to our time together today. I have a really special guest that we're going to chat with today. But let's start by, kind of pointing out perhaps the obvious, and that is that, nowadays many practitioners are potentially kind of stuck between two extremes, right? Conventional care, uh, and we'll just say that sometimes they tend to react a little late in the game, right? Um, we're going to dig more into that. And then there's functional or alternative approaches that sometimes can feel a little overwhelming for people, right? They don't know where to start, they don't know what to believe and trust. So the answer or the question becomes, how do we actually simplify this process for people and create a clear path that works for all of us in this path, and especially our clients and patients? And that is what we're going to delve into today. I'm so looking forward to this conversation. And I'm Leslie Bytel, business strategist and registered dietitian. And I work specifically with integrative and functional medicine and nutrition practitioners on building a more structured, effective, and scalable care models. And today I am joined by Dr. Scott Resnick. And Dr. Scott is a physician and creator of the I Heal system. And this is a framework designed to bring clarity and strategy into functional health. And I'm just going to read a little bit about Dr. Resnick's background. He earned his MD from the University of Colorado, completed 6 years of post grad training in surgery and OBGYN, and later transitioned into functional medicine after seeing how often natural approaches succeeded where conventional care fell short. So he has spent over 2 decades studying integrative and systems based care, and his work focuses on helping both practitioners as well as patients cut through the noise and to ultimately create a clear, actionable path forward. So, this is going to be a really important and I also think a very practical conversation. So, let's delve in. Welcome, Dr. Scott. How are you today?
I am great. Well, thanks for that great introduction. I think we should just probably stop the talk right now and just sort of. I'm looking forward to meeting with you and just sort of sharing some of my experience, over the last several decades as a medical doctor, and to some degree, really seeing the light, in terms of what the capacity is with with healthcare. And you made a really interesting comment, which was kind of like walking that fine line. I mean, I think that all of us understand that we don't want to throw out the conventional health baby with the bathwater, right?
Sure.
I mean, there was a time a couple hundred years ago when maternal mortality was 10%. 1 out of 10 women died during childbirth.
Mm.
If I'm mountain biking and I break my leg, I want to go to a good surgeon and have some screws put in and get back on my feet. But what's interesting is that you made an interesting point, which was
Mhm.
that so much of our conventional medical uh, use right now is sort of retroactive.
Mm.
It's like after the horse has left the proverbial barn, right? And we're developing drugs for obesity once somebody is obese, and for depression once somebody is depressed, and the thing is that our current model, I think, lacks the ability to. It's just sort of built in. It's like we're trained to be diagnosis based, so you establish a diagnosis and then you pick a drug. And one thing that I realized which was missing was that at no time in my medical training did anyone ever challenge me to say, what precipitated that diagnosis? What
Mm.
happened in this person's biology and physiology to make them depressed or have an autoimmune condition? And it's interesting. Think about how many people develop autoimmunity in their mid 40s, why didn't it happen when they were 30 or 25 or
Uh-huh.
a different time in their life? So, I think we're just at an interesting confluence where there's so much science which is coming out. And with the internet, we can access all of this stuff. I mean, I can open up my computer and, learn from papers that were written in Chile or Russia or Argentina. I mean, there's so much access, but I think so many people are trying to struggle to say what is good science, what was done in a cell, what was done in humans, what can we look at that is actually going to get us feeling better? Because there's a time and a place for conventional medicine. I think it's amazing,
Absolutely.
but for so much of what is killing people around the world, certainly in developed countries, things like cardiovascular disease and diabetes, autoimmunity, cancer. I think that, the conventional way that we approach those things is retroactively. It's
Mhm.
kind of making up for lost time. And
After it's already happened.
after it's already happened, and what you and I recognize is that that looking at things from a functional, more proactive approach really lends itself to be able to, I truly believe, stave off some of these chronic diagnoses. So it's not a just because your parents were hypertensive and diabetic, it's not a genetic sentence. There are ways that you can assess your body, make behavioral and dietary and environmental changes and drive our genetics to a way which is more favorable. So we live better and we feel, our brains are clearer, we feel more healthy, we, more active.
Mhm. So let's take a little step back because I'm really curious about your backstory
Okay.
in that, because you're an OBGYN, correct? That is your original training?
Correct. That was my formal training. I was fellowship trained with the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and actually
Okay.
practiced gynecology for, let's see, from say 2001 till about 2013 or 2014. Okay, and as we were talking about before this talk, I lived in Taos, New Mexico. So I was in a small town doing, cutting edge obstetrics and gynecology. And what's
Okay.
interesting is that at that time, I found that a lot of doctors sort of like had this conventional way of looking at things. And I was realizing that, wait a minute, I've got a pelvic pain patient. Every other gynecologist in the state would bring this woman to the operating room and put in a laparoscope and do a surgical procedure.
Mhm.
But I started realizing that, some of her pain might be due to her diet. Might be
Mm,
due to, might be due to her menstrual cycling, might be due to musculoskeletal components. And so early on in my career, I realized that, and then another additional thing is that I started using bioidentical hormones right when I got out of my OBGYN residency training in
interesting.
2001. So, they made us use the synthetic hormones in training.
Yeah.
And literally the day that I got out, I was like, this is crazy. There's no reason to be replacing normal biological hormones with a synthetic molecule that interestingly, the research shows is probably dangerous to us. When you
Okay.
look at, things like Premarin and Provera, and we don't need to get into that kind of stuff. But anyways, in terms of backstory, so, 2001, I started, using diet and mind body practices, musculoskeletal work, working on people's gut to address pelvic pain. I started
Mm,
using bioidentical hormones to address, premenstrual syndrome and menopausal symptoms, and I started realizing that there's this whole world out there of sort of natural and alternative medicine. And what happened was in about 2010 or 2012, I basically put myself into a state of adrenal fatigue. Now, I don't like using those terms because that's not an
okay.
accurate term, but I was buying a house, I was building a house, I was selling a house, I was running a medical practice, I was closing a medical practice, I was moving to a different state to start a new medical practice. My stress was out the roof, and
Okay.
I basically crashed. And in typical fashion, I went to go see my doctor, and the doctor did the basic blood count and the chemistry panels and evaluated my thyroid, got a TSH, right, and
Mhm.
said, Scott, everything's fine. And I was like, I'm not fine. It's like I have no energy to make it through the day. I'm taking naps in the middle of the afternoon. I mean, my libido was non-existent. I just felt horrible. And so I was like, wait a minute, I started studying this functional medicine. Maybe I should start applying some of this testing to
Ah,
myself, right?
interesting.
And I think that, just certainly with the people that you work with, I think that would be one of the most important things that I would tell everybody who's listening to this podcast or this live is if you're interested in this, make yourself your own first patient. And
Mhm.
So I remember going to my first A4M conference, and I met a retired cardiothoracic surgeon from Australia. And my ex-wife was like, "Oh, let me guess, you went to this conference and there's a bunch of Dr. Flunkies." And I was like, "No, this is the cream of the crop. These are the smartest people that I've met." And he looked at me and he said, "Scott, if you want to really know how to do functional medicine, start testing yourself." That was
Okay,
that's the
that's
first
great
clue,
advice.
and learn on yourself. Anyway, so that's what I started doing like in 2012. And what I realized is that two things happened. One, my cortisol was destroyed. My adrenal
Mm,
function was out. And secondary to that, my thyroid wasn't working well. So I put myself into a state of kind of adrenal fatigue with hypothyroidism. I was
okay.
gaining weight, my thinking wasn't working well. And then I started, I was like, okay, well, I'm studying all this stuff. Let me start applying some of these things that I've been working on to my most important patient, which was myself,
Yeah.
right?
And
And
to be clear, what were your labs your, 'cause I think you said you went to your doctor
yeah,
first.
no,
So
no,
were
this
your labs kind of within normal limits?
oh, this brings up a really, really good point, and that is that, so the standard testing for thyroid is to obtain a TSH, right?
Yep,
I'm sure you know that stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. And what that is it's a hormone that the pituitary gland makes that basically tells your thyroid gland make more or less thyroid hormone. And unfortunately, all that most conventionally trained doctors check is a TSH. My TSH was smack dab in the middle of the normal range.
really?
The
Okay.
normal range is zero point 0.5 to 5, and mine was 2.5.
Okay.
But when I tested my free hormones and my free T3 and my free
Yep,
T4, these were actually out of the laboratory's range. So this was an example of how, conventional testing, yeah, good thinking. Let's check your thyroid gland.
right.
Your TSH is 2.5. That's not the problem. But when I
Mm.
looked at my free hormones, like I said, my free T3 and my free T4, each of these were out of range. So, I
Mhm.
was, and my body was screaming hypothyroidism. My
Yeah.
hair was dry, my skin was
Oh
dry, I was
my gosh.
fatigued, I was tending towards constipation, like
Yeah.
everything was, but my doctor said your thyroid is normal. The other thing that the
So
doctor did
frustrating.
is he did a cortisol test.
Okay.
And
Okay.
and he and it was like, okay, that's a smart thinking doctor. It's like, you've been really stressed,
Yeah.
you're out of energy. Let's measure your cortisol. So he did a blood cortisol test. And this went along with my TSH. 8 o'clock in the morning, went to the lab, drew blood, and he said,
Okay.
"Scott, your serum cortisol is normal," which it was. And the normal range is really, really broad. But when I
Mhm.
did again, so I went back and went to my functional lab and I ordered a 4-part salivary cortisol test on myself. And guess
Mhm.
what? It wasn't anywhere near normal.
Okay.
So I had really suppressed my cortisol function. If all you looked at was the blood test,
Mhm.
and even that, measuring cortisol for a conventionally trained doctor is still pretty insightful. I got to give them credit for that. It
Mhm.
would have said my cortisol was normal. If all you'd measured was my TSH, looking for my, thyroid function, it would have said that I was normal. And
Right.
how many people
Rather
watching this?
concerning.
Yeah, so how many people out there watching this broadcast, right, are going to their conventional trained doctors, and the doctors are trying to get the right information,
Mhm.
but they're falling short. And in some ways, we're not trained any differently. I mean, I remember having a thyroid
Mhm.
expert in medical school say, the only thing you need to check is a TSH. If it's between zero point 0.5 and 5
Mm.
and it's normal, you're done thinking about the thyroid. How many people are walking around with symptoms of hypothyroidism that can affect everything from menstrual cycling to fertility to weight
Mhm.
gain to cognition to depression, cardiovascular health? Each of these diagnoses is unquestionably associated with a hypo or a low functioning thyroid gland, but we're not given the tools in conventional medical training to really go deeper. And that was in my case
Mhm.
doing a full thyroid panel, really understanding what's going on with my cortisol, and then being able to take the steps to make some changes.
'Kay.
So i'm still telling you about my backstory, right? So
Yeah.
that's when I, Scott Resnick, became my own VIP patient, because I really needed to figure out what was going on. And around 2012, I did a fellowship in a regenerative and anti-aging medicine with what I think is one of the best groups in the U.S., which is the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine.
Mhm.
And as I was starting to share with you, I was I was sitting in a lecture, and a really bright doctor, a guy named Jim Laval, said, I see things kind of trending in triads. There's insulin, cortisol, and thyroid, and there's testosterone and estrogen and progesterone. And there's kind of like this gut immune brain relationship. And he said, there's got to be some way that all these different things kind of fit together, but I haven't really figured it out yet. And I went home that night to my hotel room at this conference, and I just grabbed a big sheet of paper and I started making notes to myself. And
Okay.
what I realized is that there is a way that this stuff fits together. And what I realized is that we can deconstruct the human body into a set of interrelated, prioritized, and almost hierarchical systems that need to be addressed in order to have our higher order functioning processes, things like our heart and our brain and our reproductive abilities, to really be working well, right? And what I
Mhm.
found is I found that people were coming into my medical practice. These are my patients, with literally stacks of research papers that they'd been to their primary doctor saying, look, I want to talk to you about detoxification or
Yeah.
gut health or epigenetics or the microbiome or anything like that. And the doctors were like, well, I can put you on a antidepressant. I can put you on birth control pills. That's what I got for you today.
Yes.
So there was all this desire for people to really understand how their body was working,
Mhm.
but there wasn't a real coherent path to doing so. And what I recognized, courtesy of Dr. Jim Laval and my late night in this, hotel room during this conference, was I figured out a way to address and measure and in fact simplify the way that we look at our biology and our physiology. And what's cool about it is that this is what I've been using with my patients in direct patient care for like 12 or 15 years at this point. Now it has matured, it has iterated, it's changed a little bit over this time frame. But if you'd like to, I could share that with you, because
I
what it
I would
is
love
it's
that.
it's a really interesting
Yeah.
way of
So is this your
reformatting.
systems-based approach?
This is the systems-based approach,
Okay.
okay? And let me just let me contrast that with something. So the other good training program for like natural and alternative, healthcare is something
Mhm.
called Institute of Functional Medicine.
Mhm.
Okay. And I remember seeing one of their diagrams where they had like a central circle that said you and your genetics. And then, like spokes on a wheel, they had epigenetics and stress and nutrition and hormones and diet and toxins, I don't know, environmental factors,
Right.
and they're like, this is what you need to get people better. But as you can tell, where do you start? Do you start with nutrition? Do you start with
Okay.
epigenetics? Do you start with hormones? Do you start with gut health? Do you start with,
Right.
you
That's a
take
good
out
point.
people's black mold? So even within these big, institutionalized, testing programs, there was no rhyme or reason. And I think one thing that people are struggling with is that the patients were trying to find a path, and I have found that there are a lot of practitioners as well that are really struggling to say, what do I do first?
Okay.
Okay. So that's where we're talking right now. Sort of this confluence of one, recognizing that natural and alternative medicine works, but the powers that be, like the American Medical Association and the insurance companies, are clumping everything together. So you've got, Mark Hyman and Andrew Huberman in their minds, clumped in with the medical medium. It's like this, or
Oh,
with
boy.
with the idea of like, vitamins are expensive urine, right? There's sort of like, so there's no confluence. And yet there's a huge number of people in the country, something to the tune of maybe 50 or $100 billion a year, of people trying to find natural alternatives to their health. Okay,
Mhm.
so what I discovered and have been using is what I call the Resnick Health Systems Pyramid, because I developed this. So just
Okay.
imagine a pyramid, okay?
Okay.
And it's based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I know that you know who this is, but just for the listeners who don't know, Maslow was like a 1960s or 1970s American psychologist. And he built a pyramid basically of human health, I guess. And
Mhm.
at the top is a fully realized human, someone who's happy and healthy and productive and not depressed and, going on through the day and, doing well. But one arrives there through the foundation is having food and water. And then maybe the next layer is having a roof over your head. And then the next layer above that is community. And as you start building these things on top of one another, each dependent on the underlying layer, you arrive at a fully realized, happy, healthy human. So
Mhm.
my health systems pyramid is based on the same principle, and that is that at the very top of the pyramid, okay, is are the higher order processes in our body, things like cognition and thinking, the way that our mind works, and ultimately the way that our body, reproduction. Now, um, you know, humans probably weren't supposed to live on this planet till they were 85 years old, historically we didn't make it that long, but we're so we weren't, it's the whole point of being a human is to mature, reproduce, pass on your genes to the next generation, like any
Right,
animal. That's
right.
what keeps our species going, right? So what happens is that, you know reproduction is a higher order process. Now let's not get into what happens when we get into the menopausal years, or, I mean, I'm 63, so it's, obviously I mean, I've had my kids and stuff like that. But the thing is that, reproduction is a higher order process. So when I look at the pyramid, okay, the foundation is nutrition. All right. But
Mhm,
I'm not talking diet. So many people are caught up in, paleo or carnivore or high fat, low fat, Mediterranean. And just for the record, I think the Mediterranean diet is the best diet out there.
mhm.
But when I look at sort of this pyramid of health, the foundation is, what does our body's physiology need to run? Right. This is like basic biology and biochemistry. We need amino acids, right, which are the building blocks of life, and that's how we make our proteins. We need fats because all of our cell walls are made out of fat, and
Mhm.
and there are good fats and there are bad fats, and we obviously want to have more of the good fats and fewer of the bad fats. We need to have the right amount of vitamins and minerals. But as you know, because of dietary choices, because of literally where we live in the United States, for example, there are nutritional deficiencies. I mean, I saw it estimated that something like, there's 50% less magnesium in kale now than there was in
Mm,
1960s, so people are having a harder time, meeting their nutritional needs, even though they might be eating a relatively healthy diet. And then the last thing in the foundation of this pyramid are plant-based nutrients. So
okay.
these are just the different nutrients that come in plants, right? So that's foundational, right? And what's cool about what we're talking about is all this stuff can be measured. So you can measure the balance of the fats in the body. You can measure a huge assortment of vitamins and minerals. You can actually measure how well our metabolism is working. So that's foundational, and it makes sense that if your machinery is lacking, you're not going to be able to conduct the higher order, more complex processes downstream.
Right.
All right. So that in my, Scott Resnick's kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Yes.
foundation is nutrition. All right. And so much of
Okay.
this can be measured and then managed, whether it's through diet or supplementation. Okay. So if you're an animal in nature, doing your best to stay healthy and, reproduce and pass on your genetics to the next generation, the next thing you need and the next layer in this pyramid is how our body manages energy. Okay. And again, a tip of the hat to Jim Laval in this conference, because he said, there are three hormones that track together, which are insulin and cortisol and thyroid.
Okay.
And I went home that night into my hotel room. I was like, yeah, those they do track together, but how is this? And this is what I'll share with you right now, which is kind of cool. So any living being on this planet needs to extract energy from the environment. Whether you're a
Mhm.
tree attracting sunlight, or you're a, whale eating plankton, whatever you are, we need to take in energy, right? And we need to use some for the here and now, and ideally we need to store some away for a rainy day. So as humans, a vast amount of time that we've been on this planet, we've been hunter gatherers, right? So we didn't know when we were going to find our next, meal. We didn't know for sure that the crops were going to come in. We didn't know if the bison were going to migrate near our camp, and we were able to kill one, right? So our body is built for periods of feast and famine.
Mm,
And this is how we use insulin, cortisol, and thyroid. All right. So
mhm,
essential to being alive is managing energy. Because you can think about it. If you can't take in energy at a certain point, you're not going to be able to survive any longer. I mean, you
mhm.
you can't find food for 6 months, you're going to die. It's that simple. So we've
Yep.
got three hormones. So the first is cortisol. And so often we think of cortisol as being our stress hormone, like run away from a
Mhm.
tiger, right?
Yep.
But the thing is that cortisol's real job, and if I open up my biochemistry book and read the very first sentence on cortisol, it says cortisol's job is to raise our blood sugar to keep our brain alive.
Mm,
It's that simple, right? Yeah, tigers jump out at you, from the brush once every 10 years, but on a daily basis, we're needing to raise our blood sugar to keep our brain alive, as
Yep.
exemplified by the fact if you've ever looked at a salivary cortisol curve or a cortisol pattern over the course of the day, it's low during the day, it rises up in the nighttime when we sleep, and then it comes down again. Now, that
Mm.
rise is like 7 times the level of cortisol what we have during the day. Why is that?
Hmm.
It's because historically, when the sun went down, we went into our caves and went to sleep. We had our last meal if we ate at 5 o'clock at night.
Yep.
So, what happens 9 hours later at 3 in the morning when we've been sleeping? We have exhausted all of our blood glucose supply. So
Mhm.
our cortisol rises up in the middle of the night to scavenge some extra energy from our fat or from our protein, or take some
Okay.
extra minerals from our bones. So cortisol is our stay alive hormone. Okay. So it breaks down the body to stay alive. It converts our bones into magnesium and calcium and what else? Zinc, for use in other places. It breaks down our muscles into amino acids to be used elsewhere, and it breaks down our fat into energy. And while we're at it, cortisol also shrinks our brain too, but we don't want to get into that in
Mhm.
this discussion. Okay. Cortisol melts the body, right? That's the take home message here.
Okay.
Cortisol keeps us alive by melting our body. But when we can find food to eat, so we find that mango tree that's covered in mangoes, the tribe kills the bison, and we jerky beef for the winter. That's when we make insulin. And insulin's job is a growth hormone, and its job
Mhm.
is to store energy. So what happens is when we eat, our body's not releasing cortisol because we're eating. Well, I'm
Mhm.
assuming we're not being chased by a tiger at the same time as we're eating, right? Our body releases insulin. Insulin's a growth hormone. So we start to rebuild those different sources that we
Okay.
went through in the period of starvation. So we build our fat supplies, we build our muscles, we strengthen our bones. This is what insulin does, right? So you can see that cortisol and insulin are kind of like a yin yang, right? And
Absolutely.
ideally, they're in balance, right, in a healthy body. And then
Mhm.
the last thing, which is so cool that I kind of had this eureka moment about, was thyroid. Thyroid is our thermostat. So if you're God or you're nature or you're designing a human being and you knew that that human had to maybe go for a day or two or a week or so without eating food, let's just say that it's going to be a long winter and we didn't store food, from the harvest didn't come in the fall, right?
Mhm.
Do you want that person to be running at a high metabolism or a low metabolism? A low metabolism,
Right.
clearly. So if we've got a finite number of calories that we have packed onto our skeleton, right? And we're not able to find food, which is a high cortisol, high stress state, right? Remember, cortisol is elevated. It's breaking down our body just to keep glucose in the bloodstream to keep our brain alive. We would want to default to a relatively hypothyroid state.
Right.
So it should be no wonder that when people get into like cortisol, states of cortisol dysfunction, high cortisol, that we see so many cases of hypothyroidism. And the best
Okay.
example I can give is the example that with which we started this discussion, which was that I was so stressed. My cortisol was out the roof, right?
Mhm.
Ultimately, over time, I crashed it. But with that high cortisol, my body defaulted to a hypothyroid state. It's what the human body does in nature.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm doing is I'm saying, let's take a different look at how human physiology works by simplifying and deconstructing things. And that's what I'm sharing with you right now. So the simple deconstructed look at a new way of looking at human physiology is look, start with nutrition. You know, we know what the body needs. 90% of it we can measure. Let's do that. Okay. Then the next layer is to say, we know how important it is for a human animal to take energy out of the environment. Let's measure our cortisol and our insulin and our thyroid. We can do all these things. And I think that one of the things which is unfortunate is too often those hormones are not evaluated in concert with one another.
Ah.
And hopefully you can see that all
Yeah.
these things relate to one another. I mean, cortisol influences how our insulin works.
Mhm.
Thyroid influences how our insulin works. Cortisol influences how our
Mm.
thyroid works, and that's really interesting because when we get into a high cortisol state, we start. There are several different mechanisms in our body that put us into a hypothyroid state. So our TSH comes down. We don't convert our T4 into T3. We make more reverse T3, right? All of
Mhm.
these things are steps to say, hey, if you're starving and you've got X number of calories tacked onto your body, we want to make those calories last as long as we possibly can because till the bunnies and the berries and the fish come back, or till the mango tree goes into bloom again, or you can
Right.
kill an elk, right? So this is just normal physiology. So now, so far we've got like the first two layers, okay, which is nutrition, not
Mhm.
diets, nutrition, okay?
Okay.
And then above that, how our body maintains energy, insulin, cortisol, and thyroid, okay? And now the next layer above that, again, thanks to Jim Laval, he said, there's a relationship between gut, immune, and lymphatics,
Hmm.
okay? And I kind of converted it to kind of like gut, immune, and brain. And in a simplified fashion, it's maintaining our barriers to the outside world. Okay, so stay with me here. So we've got
Okay.
nutrition foundationally, right? We've got energy next, and then we have the ability to maintain our barriers. Okay. So what does that mean? It means that you and I, as we sit here, are a walking, talking petri dish. We are filled with all the glucose and all the amino acids and fat and water that any self respecting microbe on this planet would love to get into because they require all the same nutrients that our body is made of. So we maintain barriers to the outside world. The tricky thing is that all these microbes are invisible to the human eye. So, we maintain different barriers. These are barriers like our skin and our gut. There's the
Hmm. Of
lining of our lungs. I'm sure you've heard of the blood brain barrier. So there's
course.
all these interfaces that basically help to separate us from the outside world. So what happens is we need to maintain these barriers to be healthy because as the barriers start breaking down, what is it that lies right beneath these barriers, which is our immune system? And it's been
Okay.
said that something like 70% of our immune system cells lie within 1 centimeter of the lining of our gut.
Hmm.
But as you know, the lining of our gut is a single cell layer thick that basically separates everything in the outside world from our inner workings. So, what's interesting is that when we become nutritionally deficient, and this is when you can start to see how these different layers stack, right?
Mhm.
When we're nutritionally deficient and our insulin and cortisol, our thyroid aren't working well, our gut stops working well. Why is that? Cortisol diverts blood away from the gut. I mean, if you're trying to keep the human body alive and you're not
Interesting.
eating, why send blood to the gut? We know that a hypothyroid state sends blood away from the skin. That's why one of the classic signs of hypothyroidism is cold hands and cold feet.
Okay.
So again, this is all going down to a very ancestral way of saying, what does the human body need to stay alive? And so what happens is as we become nutritionally deficient, as our cortisol, insulin, and thyroid are go out of balance, we lose the ability to maintain the barriers against the outside world, which means we start getting sick more, which means that some of
Mm.
these microbes begin to get greater access to our body, and our immune system becomes dysregulated as well. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, I'm loving this.
So this is, again, we're what's interesting is that what I'm sharing with you now accounts for every diagnosis, every bodily function, everything that I can think of, short of like inbred genetic problems. I mean, it's not going to take a
Mhm.
trisomy 21 and fix, lose make two chromosomes from three. In other
Mhm.
words, but from everything from hypertension to depression to diabetes, it all fits into this sort of schema that I'm sharing with you. So it's really important that we maintain our barriers because our immune system lies just beneath all of these barriers.
Mhm.
And what happens is when those barriers start to break, our immune system gets bombarded with all these environmental signals. So they get bombarded with the wrong type of bacteria in our gut, environmental toxins and pesticides and herbicides and all these, millions of chemicals that we can come in contact with. The same thing applies to our skin because as our stress gets high, our cortisol goes high, we become relatively hypothyroid, our skin starts to break down, and then you
Mm.
get cracked cuticles and you get, I mean, we get
Interesting.
more skin issues. So this we lose the ability to protect ourselves. I mean, so maintaining a barrier is such an important
Okay.
component of being alive. So once again, foundational is nutrition. The next layer is how our body extracts energy out of the environment. So that's insulin, cortisol, and thyroid working in concert. When those are working well, we can maintain our barriers. And that's primarily the barriers of our lungs and our skin and our gut. But remember, there's a blood-brain barrier. There's a barrier under our blood vessels as well. There's smaller barriers, but are equally as
Okay.
important. Well, why are barriers important? Because that's how we detoxify. right? We need to get rid of toxins across these barriers. We detoxify through our lungs,
Mhm.
through our skin, and through our gut, and through our kidney as well, right? So in stacking things from the bottom up, you can see that if somebody is trying to establish, say, a detox program for somebody, they need to be thinking about how their gut works first. But before they think about how their gut works, they need to be thinking about how their cortisol works. Because if your
Okay.
cortisol is out the roof, you are never going to fix your gut. And if you're nutritionally
Interesting.
deficient, none of these systems are going to work. So, so now we're at the nutritional foundation. Insulin, cortisol, thyroid for managing energy, maintains our barriers. When that's working well, we can detoxify. And detoxification is a fairly energetic process as well. I mean,
Mhm.
just and here's what's interesting. I want to share something about detox. And so many people think that detoxification is getting rid of all the chemicals that we're surrounded. The BPA's and the
Mhm.
plastics and the phthalates and the I don't know pesticides and herbicides and stuff like that. But what's interesting is that we need to detox from our own metabolic processes. And the classic example is that when we use oxygen to make energy, we make carbon dioxide. So we need to detoxify our carbon dioxide, meaning that if somebody held a pillow over my face and I couldn't detoxify my carbon dioxide, I would live for 5 more minutes and that's it. So there's a
Okay.
detox pathway. The other thing is that when our mitochondria make energy, again, using oxygen to make energy for our cells, we develop something called reactive oxygen species. And you might have heard of these before.
Mhm.
This is basically what inflammation is reactive oxygen species. We need
Okay.
to be able to buffer those. So we need to be detoxing from our body's own metabolic processes. When we have estrogen in our body, estrogens need to be detoxified. They get detoxed through
Mhm.
phase 1 and phase 2 detox. This requires our liver and a healthy gut. So
Mhm.
we detoxify our estrogens through our gut. So I just want to, just making the point, bringing the point home that, people think detox, they're only thinking, oh, black mold or, like
Right.
toxins or BPA or something like that. We need to be able to detox from our own metabolic processes, and we need to detox across our barriers, which is our skin because we sweat, which is our gut because we poop, our lungs when we breathe, and our kidneys when we urinate. Okay. And now that brings us to the top of the pyramid where we've got things like our reproductive hormones. So let's go back to that ancestral genetics. Okay. So
Okay.
if you're fertile, let's say you're a 30-year-old woman, whose tribe didn't kill an elk and the crops didn't come in, and you're crawling in for another, the groundhog didn't see its shadow. It's going to be a long winter. You're crawling into your cave, your cortisol is breaking down your body to keep you alive, just
Okay.
scavenging, every last little mineral from your bones, your fat, your muscles, just to keep us alive. Do you think that's a good time for that animal that's trying to stay alive to have a monthly menstrual cycle and lose 80 cc's of blood and iron onto the floor of
No.
her cave? Of course not. So is that a time to have a nice roll in the hay with your caveman partner? Probably not. So what happens is when our stress gets high, we get to a relatively hypothyroid state because we go into hibernation mode. And nature
Mhm.
and God and just survival has said, you know what? We'll take a winter of low libido, foggy thinking, dry hair, cold hands, cold feet, constipation, feeling like crap to keep this animal alive until when they can start to find
Okay.
food again, right? So you can see how these reproductive hormones up at the very top of the pyramid are contingent on being able to detoxify well, are contingent on a gut that works well, are contingent about being able to find energy, and ultimately contingent upon the lower levels of this process. So now we've built like this pyramid, if I get this right. Okay. And up at the
Yep.
very top is probably higher order functions, so uh brain and heart, right? But I'm giving the heart too much due here, because really the heart is just kind of like a glorified pump, right? That's all it
Right.
does. I mean, really what makes us human is our brain. And then the last thing I would draw out for my patients would be, so we've kind of constructed this pyramid, right? Just imagine taking a tiny little red dot on the bottom and putting it underneath that pyramid. And I would tell my patients, this represents inflammation, because when we
Okay.
have a little bit of inflammation, that pyramid can stay in balance. Okay. And then what I would do is I would take that dot and I'd draw like a big dot and kind of make the pyramid kind of tilt and, cattywampus. And I'd say, when we're inflamed, all of these different processes, our ability to absorb nutrition, our ability to balance insulin, cortisol, thyroid, our barriers, all that stuff starts to fall apart. So, inflammation, as you know, really is the tide that binds for all aging, for all chronic disease, and so many symptoms. Whether it's depression, anxiety, pain syndromes, all these things come down to inflammation. So
Okay.
that's basically it. So what I've shared with you is a way of deconstructing the body into a set of prioritized,
Okay.
hierarchical, measurable, and actionable systems, um, based on just a different way of looking at health, which is not saying, hey, what is your symptom? Oh, I'm depressed. Oh, take an antidepressant. No, let's do that. Can we want to break down a diagnosis through the system? Should we do that?
Yeah, I would love that. Yeah, I think that would be a really practical exercise so that
Great.
we can see how to apply it.
Okay, so let's look conventional medicine. You're
Okay.
depressed, right?
Okay.
What does your doctor do? Puts you on an antidepressant.
Yep.
Pretty easy, right? And then your libido and you start gaining weight and your energy goes, all the side
All
effects.
the things.
And long-term studies really showed that the antidepressants don't work that well. Okay, so let's look at through the the Resnick's health systems pyramid.
Okay.
Okay, so foundational is nutrition, right? We know that there've been a lot of good studies looking at depression, looking at balance of the pro-inflammatory omega-6 fats and the anti-inflammatory omega-3 fats. We can measure these things. We know that depression is associated with B vitamin deficiencies, so like B6 and B9 and B12 in particular. The ability to reconvert homocysteine, okay, has been associated with our ability to make serotonin. All right, so we need these B vitamins. Vitamin D has been associated with depression. I don't want to go through all the different things, but you can see that there's a lot of nutritional
Yeah.
markers. So let's go to that next level. There are so many papers out there that look at high and low cortisol levels with depression. Such a strong association. It's not even worth
Interesting.
repeating. Okay, how about hypothyroidism? If I were to go to PubMed and type in, thyroid and depression, there have been 10,000 clinical
Yeah.
studies that have looked at that. Insulin, a little less so, but insulin is directly associated with inflammation. And if there's
Hmm.
one thing that's associated with depression, it's inflammation. Okay. The
Hmm.
next layer, gut. Boy, as you know, there's so much literature and research coming out about how many of our
Yeah.
neurotransmitters are being made in the gut and how our interface with this 100 trillion microbe strong microbiome influences our cognition and our thinking. So things like GABA, which is our primary calming neurotransmitter, is now thought to be made primarily in our gut. We've known for years that 90% of our serotonin, and serotonin is what all the antidepressants raise, basically.
Hmm.
Serotonin is the feel good in your world hormone. 90% of our serotonin is made in our gut. So we're learning that our cognition and our brain is really can be closely tied into gut function. So remember, your well-intended primary care doctor said you're depressed. Let's put you on an antidepressant. They're not thinking about your nutritional state. They're not thinking about your insulin, cortisol, thyroid. They're not thinking about,
Not at all.
whether you could have something chronic going on in your gut or an ongoing inflammatory process or even a parasite or something like that. Okay. How about toxins? Same thing. There's so much literature out there showing that as we develop a greater toxic load, whether these endogenous toxins I mentioned, things like carbon dioxide and these reactive oxygen species, or environmental toxins, these causes our brain not to work so well. And then if there's one thing that's strongly associated with depression is it's inflammation.
Mm.
So there's just an example. We could take hypertension, we could take diabetes and walk it through the same modality of thinking. So what this does, and I think what I shared with you, and hopefully all your viewers and listeners aren't lost right now, okay? But the whole point is to say that I think there's a different way of breaking down health with a natural and alternative, functional approach, which simplifies things. So what's cool
I do
about what I
too.
just shared with you is that each of these different strata that, as I mentioned, account for 98% of all illnesses that are out there, whether chronic ones like cancer and, diabetes and
Mhm.
autoimmunity, or even things like aches and pains and frequent colds and tummy pains and stuff like that, can all be walked through this system. And what it does is it creates discrete questions that we can ask and then we can address with laboratory answers. So, in other words, is my cortisol out the roof? Well, I'm fretting all the time. I'm screaming at my kids in the afternoon. I can't turn off my brain at night. I'm waking up at 4 in the morning. Your cortisol probably is not working well, right?
Mhm,
Okay, so that self reflective question would then say, good, maybe I need to measure a cortisol test on myself.
mhm,
Okay. Or you have dry hair, dry skin, fatigue, your periods are off, you're constipated, you have no energy, and you're, low all the time. Your doctor has said your TSH is normal.
mhm.
Maybe that's not a complete, thyroid screen. So, what I recognized is that on one hand, there was like a population that wanted to understand this stuff. And then there was all this information that to my eyes had not been put into kind of like a coherent, practical, um, like almost like a prototype, not a prototype, almost like a system.
Uh-huh. Like a
And so
protocol kinda thing?
like a protocol.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's basically what I've developed and I've spent the last
Okay.
10 years working on is saying, how can we create a protocol and a system that's hierarchical, that's discrete, that whereby we can. So I've created a program that basically says, look, starting at square zero, let's instruct people on the biology and the physiology, understand the important things of how our body works with some self-reflective questions. Then you can then begin to ask the questions, what is the most important test that I need to test on myself? And then
Uh-huh.
what's cool is that there, so much of this stuff is accessible to the public these days. You
It
can
really is.
you can do thyroid testing on yourself, you can do cortisol
Okay.
testing, you can access so many minerals and vitamins that can be beneficial without having to go through mainstream medicine. So basically what I shared with you is a way to try to take all this noise and confusion and sort of like frantic approach to natural and alternative medicine and say,
Right.
look, let's take a nice deep breath and realize that we can simplify this. We can
Okay.
create order and structure and priority, and so much of what we're talking about we can measure. So if somebody's struggling and really not feeling well, from what you know about my process, is the first thing to put them on a like a parasite cleanse? Probably not. Now
Probably not.
they might, but
Mm,
the thing is, if their cortisol's out the roof and their insulin's not working
okay.
well and they're hypothyroid, I guarantee you that that's a much bigger hammer to adjust their physiology than maybe
Then
having a
cleanse.
parasite. And they
Yeah.
might have a parasite, but I've done hundreds and hundreds of these really advanced like DNA based tests,
Mhm.
DNA hybridization tests to look for like needle in a haystack for parasites. There are fewer parasites than you'd think. I know that you'd think that going online, that's like, like everyone's got, loads of
Yeah.
parasites. We get parasites, don't get me wrong, but we get hypothyroid and dysfunctional with our insulin and dysfunctional with our cortisol and nutritionally deficient far more often than we get a parasite. That's all I'm saying. So this,
That
what
makes
I shared
sense.
with you is hopefully helps people to begin to stratify and prioritize and develop some order to how we're looking
Mhm.
at what makes the body work. I mean, that's all it is.
It sounds like that the hormone triad,
Hmm.
well, that's the second layer after nutrition, right?
Correct. Insulin,
So,
cortisol, and thyroid. Right.
yeah, that
Energetics.
is
Right.
fascinating in of itself. So what my takeaway is, and you tell me if this is off base at all, but it sounds like, I mean, other than nutrition, and you mentioned the Mediterranean approach, which
Hmm.
is very research backed. Um, it sounds like we need to do some testing. And
I,
would you agree that we need to look at all three of those,
I do, and
like,
and
pretty much
I
for
think that
everyone?
the important thing is we need to do the right testing
Okay.
on the right people. So remember, my conventionally trained doctor tested my thyroid.
I know,
He he
which is
tested he
frightening.
he tested my cortisol. It
Okay.
wasn't done right. And I can say that just in my, 12, 15 years of using this kind of thought process with my
Mhm.
patients, I can tell you that 80% of what people struggle with is found in like those first like two or three layers. It's in nutritional
Yeah,
deficiencies, it's in
that's what it sounds
imbalances
like.
in insulin, cortisol, and thyroid. Let me
Okay.
tell you that if you can get those two things fixed, the the vast majority of these downstream things are going to start working
I
better. Your
know, I was
moods are going to feel better.
thinking
Your periods will start getting better. Your gut's going to
your
start feeling
energy,
better.
your
Your
focus.
energy, your focus, all that stuff is going to start coming
Mhm.
back.
Okay, so all right, so we have this deeper dive that we need to be doing with
Correct.
our clients and patients in terms of the testing, right? Because
Correct.
the one little, test for thyroid just is not cutting it, clearly.
Right.
And
Exactly.
that's what our patients are exposed to for the most part. So
Correct.
what do we do
And,
about that?
well, and what's tricky is that they're out there going to YouTube channels, going to podcasts. They're,
Yeah.
watching Andrew Huberman do 2.5 hour long talks,
Mhm.
trying to learn and to figure out
Yeah.
what is it that they can do to start feeling better. Because they're like, I don't want to take birth control pills for my abnormal cycles.
Mhm.
Research shows birth control pills increase breast cancer risk. I don't want that.
Right?
Um, I don't want to take an antidepressant. I tried that. It did, that doesn't help me. It really made me feel poorly.
Mhm.
The problem is that there's so much noise out there. And what I'm trying to do is to say, let's quiet the noise. And
Okay.
so everything that I just shared with you, every one of these little strata that we went through, this is basic biology and biochemistry and physiology. It's
Mhm.
not it's not a bone broth diet. It's not a coffee
Yeah.
enema. It's not it's just
Yeah.
basically saying, look, our body needs certain things to make our cells and our
Mhm.
enzymes and our DNA work well. So let's get down to basics and like you said, make the measurements of these things. Because too often I think that the measurements aren't made right or
Okay.
they're not prioritized well. I mean, I've seen so many people come into my practice who have had a well-intended practitioner having them on some kind of a gut cleanse
Mhm.
when their cortisol is out of control.
Okay.
When our cortisol is high, it diverts blood from our gut. That's just what cortisol does. So,
Mhm.
how are you going to fix your gut if you're not getting
Not
blood
gonna
flow to it?
happen.
If you're not delivering. Oh, and one more thing about just an interesting aside about the gut is, remember I told you it's lined by a single cell lining.
Yep.
Okay, it's called the gut mucosa. That gut mucosa fully regenerates itself every 3 to 5 days. Fully regenerates the
Okay.
cells.
Hmm.
Okay, so if you're nutritionally deficient, right? If you're missing the amino acids and if your thyroid's not working well, and you're diverting blood from your gut, how are you going to regenerate the lining of your gut every 5 days without developing some degree of leaky gut? You can't.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So it really just all ties together.
Yeah,
So
it all ties together. So that's what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to objectively prove that this works. So I actually put together like a patient driven course.
mhm.
Okay, that I prototyped with 18 women in the United States. And
Okay.
part of this course was taking intake data and outtake data. In other words, I want to prove that this style of thinking works, not just because someone says they feel better, or I've got a testimonial on my website where she says, "Hey, I'm doing better." No, let's look at some objective measurements.
Okay.
And we looked at objective measurements like a number of psychosocial measurements, things like the PHQ-9, which is a well-established measurement of depression, the
Mhm.
fatigue severity scale, the Epworth sleepiness scale. We looked at the GAD-7. Again, these are standard front and center measurements of like anxiety. And we also measured the waist to hip ratio, okay,
Hmm.
which is better than the body mass index. And what we showed is that in 5 out of 6 of the tests that we measured in the beginning and measured at the end, people showed statistical improvement. And I mean statistical improvement, meaning like this is something that could be published in a scientific journal.
Okay.
Oh yeah, it wasn't perfect.
Amazing.
There were only 18 people in the, it was a pilot study basically, but there was enough improvement within the group to show that there was statistical improvement, meaning that their improvement was not due to chance. It was due to taking the course, following the
Okay.
modules, doing the laboratory testing, getting with the plan. And this course I designed really is it's to be done for it's built to take 20 to 30 minutes a day for two
Okay.
months.
Hmm.
To
Would
take
you like to share a little bit more, about that
well,
course?
okay, sure. Well, it's called that's the iHeal course that I built.
The eye heal. Okay, got it.
And what it is it's developed to empower an individual to become best stewards of their own care through natural and functional approaches based in science. Okay. Now let me just say
Okay.
that this was built for, like the general public. And I don't want to say it's dumbed down, but it's been created to a point where if somebody has a high school education, You don't
Okay.
need to be a biochemist to be able to get through it. So what it does is
Perfect.
it creates different scientific modules where it starts the course by saying, look, these are the basic things you need to know. This is how your DNA works. This is how a cell membrane works. This is what an enzyme is. This is what a nutrient does, you know? And then what it does is it does for that individual while they're going through these introductory, preparatory stages to understand how your body works, is they've sent in laboratory testing on themselves.
Okay.
And I've created a suite of 73 different biomarkers that covers all these things right. So it's if you could go to the best functional medicine doctor and get the best panel that's going to cover everything that you need, that would be a full thyroid panel and a full cortisol panel and your sex hormones through your saliva and measuring how well your B vitamins are working and your vitamin D and your fats and all this stuff that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
People do that testing on themselves. It goes to the lab. It takes a week or two to get done. They walk themselves through these introductory modules. And then, based on an individual's actual laboratory results, they can walk through an understanding of how their body is doing and then begin to assign what it is that they need to do. Now, it's really built such that a vast majority of this can be done individually. In other words, you can see, wow, my red blood cell magnesium, which incidentally is the best way to measure magnesium, is really low. Oh, here's a dosing schedule that shows how I should be dosing this. It's like, oh, my omega
Wow.
3 to omega 6 fats, these healthy versus unhealthy fats, are out of balance. Oh, here's some recommendations that can show how to do this. And really, even through like a woman who's in the perimenopause who might need to be on some progesterone, all of that stuff can be done outside of having to go talk to your doctor, who's just going to offer you birth control pills and
Right.
antidepressants. So it's built for the general public. It's actually ideal for something like a nurse practitioner or a nutritionist or a chiropractor or somebody who really wants to understand how can I be thinking about functional medicine in a way that makes it easier for me and makes it
Okay.
easier for my patient as well. Because we can measure these things, we can make dietary, supplemental, hormonal modifications on them, and then we can remeasure them once again. So I built this course. It has intake and outtake measurements, just like the prototype that I ran with this initial group. It has mile points that people can learn about, and yeah, that's kind of where we are.
Excellent. I just wanted to address this quick question. And yeah, thank you for your comment. This will be available forever, as far as I'm concerned. On for sure, definitely on YouTube, LinkedIn, all the places. Except I don't know if Instagram stores these replays, but for sure, if you go to my YouTube channel at Leslie Vitel International, you will be able to find this. And there's a separate section in YouTube. It's under the lives, just FYI there. But yeah, this is a great educational piece of content here, and we are going to make it available to everyone. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. So why don't you share, and I'll put this in the comments. Is it i.heal.com?
No, it's iheal.ca.
Ah, okay.
So
iheal.ca. Okay.
yeah,
All right. So let me post that. Um, great. Hopefully I spelled that right. I think I did.
yeah,
Awesome.
iheal.ca.
Great. Yeah.
Um, And that just, that kind of gives an overview of the program. I mean, it doesn't that website doesn't get into like a lot of the nuts and bolts of what we
Mhm.
kind of, spoke about here. That's what I do on my YouTube channel is I,
Okay.
break down these topics and try
Ah,
to say,
what is your
hey, look,
YouTube?
what's that?
What is your YouTube?
I think it's Scott Resnick MD. So it's like
Okay.
the little at sign, then Scott Resnick
Oh, yeah,
MD,
yeah.
and
Okay.
that should get people there.
Okay. Okay, great. Resnick,
Yeah,
Resnick. Okay.
correct.
Oops,
Yep.
I spelled that wrong. Okay, cool. Let me share that with everybody as well. Yep. So, YouTube channel, I will definitely check out your YouTube. This has been so
Yeah, you do.
enlightening.
And what a, and maybe a good way to, I don't know how much time you've got scheduled to meet with me, but as you can tell, I'm pretty impassioned about this stuff. I
Yeah,
love sharing it with
absolutely.
people. what I'm trying to do is my mission is to architect a new style of medicine. And I think that, having gone through all this stuff, my
Mhm.
dream, my literally my professional mission is to get enough data points using this sort of schema that we just discussed, that at a certain point, the American Medical Association, Big Pharma, the insurance companies can no longer say that vitamins are just expensive urine. In other
Right.
words, my mission and the reason I built this course was for people to start the course and input their own data and end the course and input their data and have that data to show that when they follow this program, this
Mhm.
pyramid state shaped structure and all the good things that your listeners know how to do, work
Yep.
on sleep and breathing exercises and exercise and eating healthy foods and you know avoiding the plastic water bottles, all these things that we know about. My mission is to get enough data so that the powers that be are like, you know what, boy, our insurance companies need to be offering this kind of help to people
Exactly.
through their insurance plans. I don't want the
Mhm.
insurance company saying this is bunk, this is because there are a lot of really smart people out there.
Yep.
Like I say, you listen to Andrew Huberman, you listen to Mark Hyman, there are a lot of docs out there that are saying the science exists. When I said that there are 10,000 papers, looking at low thyroid function and depression, don't take my word for it. Type in pubmed.com and
Right.
put those words into the browser bar. You'll see that this research exists. But the problem is that I want to make this more accessible to people. And the problem is that as long as the powers that be are saying that, Mark Hyman and the medical medium are basically telling you the same message about
Mhm.
functional and natural and alternative healing, we're never going to break through. Once we have a collection of data that shows that using a structured, reproducible, measurable set of protocols, at that point, I think that we can begin to make this more accessible to people and to incorporate it more into our health and healing, like countries like Germany do. Like in Germany, you
Right.
need to go to somebody who talks to you about your nutrition and talks to you about maybe using some herbs or some supplementation before you go to your surgeon. In the United States, it's the other way around. So I'm glad I got a chance to say that because that's my mission is to make this type of thinking and this type of medicine accessible in a practical sense for everybody who wants it and who
Okay.
has an insurance company or is on, like in Canada, like on the nationalized healthcare plan. Let's
Okay.
let's prove that this works well enough that's offered to people.
Okay, so you mentioned, and it sounds, and I'm on the website right now, the iheal.ca,
Hmm.
and it looks great.
Good at loaded.
It did load. I think the first version I put on here did not, but it looks like this version does. So
Okay.
if you guys have any issue, um, okay, I'm going to star that comment just to make it stand out a little bit. You can try that link. But the one thing I just wanted to double check on before we start to wrap up, you mentioned that this course was originally created for the consumer market.
Hmm.
That said, it can also be extremely helpful for other types of practitioners,
I,
right?
I think that would be the most useful.
Okay.
Not the most. I mean, I think that it was really built for both. But remember earlier in our talk, I said that I met the old cardiothoracic surgeon from
Yeah.
Australia who said, you need to be your own first patient.
Yes.
And I think that I mean, if you've got your own clients who might be
Ah,
saying, wow, I really want to learn about myself and to really have a
mhm.
totally sound foundation of how to understand the way that the body's working to simplify things, to create
Okay.
order, create a practice. I think it would be really valuable for really anyone potentially watching this video. And
Okay.
I've had a number of people who've been in the course who are nurses and I just having that extra little bit of medical training really helps. But particularly for the people who are struggling with how do you take all this information out there and create some structure and some
Okay.
order and some
Yeah, and a
protocol.
stepwise
It's gonna
process.
totally answer that.
Yeah, 'cause, just, kinda interestingly, being an RD, we always start with the gut, right?
Hmm.
Like, that is the first inclination. Everything starts in the gut, But I think one of my takeaways personally is yes, the gut is important, but perhaps that triad of hormones is really what we need to look at first.
I would argue that yes, but the thing you need to look at first is the nutritional foundation
Right. Okay.
first, because those are the things that allow the
Mhm.
machinery to work, to
Got
let
it.
our
Yep.
immune system work well, to rebuild that mucosal lining in the gut
Okay.
every 3 to 5 days. That's that's like the oil and the gas and the right
Okay.
key for your car. It's like that. Those are the basics you need to kind
Okay.
of to get things going.
Okay.
But you're right,
So,
and I mean, really, who was it? Hippocrates said that all disease begins in the gut, right?
mhm,
I agree with that. And gut health is so, so, so important. But if your cortisol is out the roof, if you're
okay.
hypothyroid, if you're inflamed, if you've got significant nutritional deficiencies in your body, your gut is never going to be able to be the driver of health that it needs to be.
Okay. So that first level, nutrition, we're looking at, the potential for deficiencies.
hmm
We're looking at
Or,
the
or,
balance
or, or
of
excesses,
or
excesses.
excesses, okay.
Right. You
Um,
don't want too much iron. You don't want too
got it.
much of the pro-inflammatory omega-3
Right.
fats. There's a few things you can have too much of that's not good. But moreover, it's probably deficiencies really due to diets and just nutritional quality of the food.
Okay. Okay. So we start with a diet.
hmm
I would assume relatively lower glycemic, right?
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Nice and balanced. We might do some nutrient, testing potentially at this level.
Correct. hmm
All right, so we get things squared away nutrient-wise, and then we move to that next layer, which is so intriguing to me, I have to say, that
hmm
triad, right?
Yeah.
I'm
It's it,
really
it's so it's
fascinated by that.
it's so interesting, and particularly when you look at it like in the context of, I gave you the example of the woman, the reproductive age woman who
Yep,
stops getting periods. It just makes perfect sense. I mean,
yeah,
our physiology is geared. We are modern humans living on ancestral genetics,
mhm,
and that's something I've said in some of my YouTube videos. It's just so important that we need to honor that. Let me just tell you this: one thing that our system was not built for, and this is the final aha moment of that hormone triad. That insulin, cortisol, thyroid,
yeah,
energetic balance, which is humans were not meant to be in a high stress, high calorie environment.
mm,
Because here's what happens: when our stress is high, our cortisol is up, our insulin doesn't work as well.
okay,
Okay. So if you're eating you said a low glycemic, index diet,
mhm,
if we're in a high glycemic diet and your cortisol is high and your insulin's not working well, where do all those calories go? They
mm,
go to your fat cells.
yep.
What do fat cells do? They basically are little inflammation factories, is
Oh,
what
very
fat cells
inflammatory.
do. And
Yep,
remember, as that inflammation gets bigger, that whole overlying pyramid gets tilted off to the side. So,
mhm,
and also when we're in a high stress state, again, this is that, the modern human who's stressed out and eating
yep,
Cheetos all day long, right? Remember, they're in a hypothyroid state because their cortisol is
okay,
high.
right,
So their metabolism is low. So you can start to see how we get into this vicious cycle of high stress, high glycemic index foods, poor insulin functioning, hypothyroidism,
mm,
cortisol dysfunction, which also causes water retention. There's the obesity and the prediabetes and
yep,
like fatty liver. That's where all this stuff
okay,
comes from.
wow.
So yeah, so it's interesting
It's
how you
really
start.
cool.
It is cool because it makes sense when you're like, wow, cortisol break melts down the body to keep us alive. It's a catabolic
Yep,
hormone,
yep,
right? Insulin is an anabolic hormone. It
mhm,
builds muscle. It deposits fat. It builds bones. And thyroid is our thermostat. So when the getting's good, when your tribe is not under attack, when the mango tree is in bloom and you guys killed an elk, we can run at a normal thyroid function.
yep,
And then guess what happens? Our gut works well. We detoxify well,
right.
and women start having normal menstrual cycles.
Okay.
Because if you're God or nature and there's plenty of food and you're not under attack and it's a sunny day, that's a good time to have a roll in the hay in your cave with your caveman husband,
A little
right?
procreation.
Wait, that's a little procreation, because when you're starving and you're stressed and you're hypothyroid and
Yeah,
you're not feeling good, is it any wonder that people's libidos are down, or
right.
men's sperm count is down, and testosterone levels are down? All this stuff ties in together. And let me just, before I forget, I wanted to make one comment. You started
Yeah.
saying, when you talk about the nutritional level of things, and this goes back to my course, is an important part of doing any kind of medicine is to do clinical self-reflection. So the thing is that if you're a vegetarian or vegan, you're very likely going to be low in your
Mhm.
B6 and your B12,
Okay.
right? If you've been on birth control pills, you might be low in B6 and B12. If you
Okay.
live in the Midwestern United States, because not, 20,000 years ago, those glaciers, scoured
Yep.
the land, there are deficiencies in iodine, you know?
Okay.
So the first step is to say, okay, let's think of my nutritional state, but wow, I've been vegetarian vegan for so many years. Oh, you're probably not going to have the branch chain amino acids that are essential amino acids. And you, as a dietitian, you know what that means,
Yep.
right?
I
If you're a
do.
vegetarian vegan, it's really hard to get that, isoleucine
Mm.
and leucine and, the branched chain amino acids that build muscles.
Yep.
So even before you start, and as built into this course, are self-reflective questions like,
Okay.
wow, what do I expect to see of myself? I never eat anything green. Well, your magnesium's probably low, right?
Mhm.
Anyway, so
I
that's
love
just
it.
yeah. So it's a different way of looking at how our body kind of
Yeah.
works, and it's based on ancestral genetics. It's based on the fact that the human body is built to survive,
Mhm.
built to survive. And I'm
It
actually
really is
pretty.
true.
It's pretty impressive how well we survive when you think of what people eat. Not the people we're talking to in this podcast, but
Right, right.
the average person in a developed country eats a lot of crap,
Yeah.
but our bodies still are able
We
to
are
keep on
built to
going.
survive. I love that. I think
Yeah,
that's
we're
a
built to
great
survive.
way to wrap up. So, all right, everybody. So, well, first of all, I want to thank you, Scott. This has been so enlightening. I can't,
Cool.
I'm kind of blown away, honestly. Um, I am so excited to have this kind of new, just this new paradigm to work with.
Yep.
So I'm really thrilled about that. Thank you to everyone who joined us for this conversation today. And hope you got a ton of value as I did. And thanks again, Scott. I hope that we can continue this conversation,
Oh, I'd love to meet with
down the
you. I mean,
line. Yeah.
absolutely. Just can put me on your speed dial, and if you ever have any
Okay.
questions and stuff I can help you with, I'm always happy to just reach
Okay.
out to me. And for people who are watching the show, if you have comments, reach out to me through my socials, or through my websites, and let's see what
Yeah.
we can do to get more people
Yeah.
feeling better,
Let's
and
do
and
that.
also to turn around this sickness juggernaut. It's like
Yeah.
40% of Americans are obese. I mean, 1 in 3
Mhm.
people are expected to get Alzheimer's disease. We can turn this stuff around.
In the
And in
tide.
this last hour, I just shared with you the exact tools that we need to do it to the best
Okay.
of our science's ability to understand that.
Okay. So, yeah, if you're up for it, I'd love to do a part two conversation because
Okay.
there's a lot of things that I wanted to delve into that we didn't quite have time for. So perhaps we can save that for another time. So, all right, everybody. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Thanks again. And a big thank you to Dr. Scott. And be sure to visit one of his website at www.iheal.ca. And also, I would say check out his YouTube channel at Scott Resnick. All right.
And one last thing, I've
Yeah.
got a scottresnickmd.com, which is just sort of like an authority
Okay.
webpage, where all this stuff is linked. And it's got blogs and
Oh, great. Okay. So
contact forms and stuff like that.
scottresnickmd.com.
Correct.
Excellent. Okay, you got lots of great resources for us. All right.
Cool.
Thank you again. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks again, Dr. Scott. Really appreciate your wisdom and your
Thank
willingness
you.
to share today. It was really great. So
Great. I had a
valuable.
good time. Let's do it again.
Awesome. Let's do it again soon. Okay, everybody, take care. Have a good day.